I would like to turn your attention to some largest conflicts in Europe in 17th century. You see this 30 Years' War in Germany between different powers there, and this conflict was so hard that even after this conflict, in many German towns and cities, the victory was celebrated by people. Like, you see that 30 Years' War united different conflicts, like the Dane with Sweden, France against the Habsburg states. Habsburg states included Spain, Portugal, and Holy Roman Empire, and Holland against Spain. So all of this was concentrated into the one conflict, into the one war, which lasted 30 years. Among the main figures of this conflict, one may call Richelieu from France, Cardinal Richelieu from France, who tried to initiate the alliance against the Holy Roman Empire, or Gustav Adolf, the King of Sweden, who organized a very effective regular army and who started the development of Sweden as the mightiful state. And finally, this war ended. And of course, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics there. This conflict began as the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Germany. And finally, the Congress of Westphalia in 1648 concluded a peace and which gave much more liberties to the Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire. And that was the first in history international conference. The first in history international conference. According to the Treaty of Westphalia, German Protestant lands acquired more autonomy, acquired more rights and liberties. Nearly 198 official participants took part in this conference. 198, the first in history international conference. First in history. The second conflict is this: the National Liberation War of Ukrainian Cossacks in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, created in 1569, is the union between Lithuania and Poland. So this state was shaped by the uprising of Cossacks. Yes. And the leader of this uprising was Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He was just a Cossack scribe. By the way, you see that in Russian language, we are pronouncing Kazakh. Yes, in Ukrainian language, we are pronouncing Kozak. And namely, this pronunciation came to English language. Cossack, not Kazakh. See, that's across Poland. It reached to English dictionaries. The word Cossack is actually Turkic origin and means free warrior. Yes, and by this time the Cossacks created a very strong community, borderland community, with the centers in Sich, Zaporozhian Sich in Ukraine, and finally they organized the revolt against the Polish. They fought for the liberties for the Orthodoxy. They fought against the serfdom. They fought for the Cossacks' liberties in general. We may distinguish several stages in this period, in this conflict in Ukraine and in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Rumors about this conflict reached even England, and the newspapers in England published the all real news of this conflict. This liberation was in 1648 to 1657, when the Hetmanate, the state of Hetmanate, was created by Cossacks, and then it was followed by the ruin period, with the invasions of the enemies, with the internal conflicts, the uprisings and the revolts, and the economic crisis in some parts of Ukraine. And you see Ivan Mazeppa's revolt as the last attempt to gain independence for Ukraine in 1708 and 1709. And finally, this revolt was eradicated, was suppressed by Peter I. And since that time, though there were very good opportunities for Ukrainian land to develop the industrial sector and to make an industrial revolution there due to the deposits of iron or the development of the trade activity there. But all these opportunities were stopped by Russia, and from 1709 there was gradual absorption of Ukraine by Russian Empire and simultaneously peasantization of Ukrainian economy. You see that Crimean Khanate, which raided Ukrainian lands constantly in 16th century and later on, Crimean Khanate was the part of Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was the largest entity in Asia created in 16th century, and that Ottoman Empire was highly centralized, and this empire had a really effective army of janissaries. They were actually the slaves, slave warriors, slave soldiers. Boys for this army were conscripted through the special tax called the devshirme. That was the special tax imposed on the Christian families. Each Christian family, from time to time, had to give one boy to authority in slavery. One boy. And this boy then was grown and educated in his Islam way, and by his adultness, he didn't remember his mother or father. He was Sultan was the father for him. He was fanatic warrior from then. Of course, such sultans as sultans of the 16th century, as Suleiman the Magnificent, created centralized, very highly developed absolutist monarchy. But then the authority was gradually, step by step, was taken over by vizier, roughly prime minister of that state, and vizier ruled, in reality, ruled empire. You see his happy face there on the slide. But the growth of bureaucracy, the growth of corruption, and the development of but keeping the traditional thinking, religious thinking, really all of this kept Ottoman Empire behind the European countries in technological development. Traditional thinking and corruption finally contributed to the decline of Ottoman Empire if compared to the European countries from the mid-17th century to the 19th century. There was another process in Hindustan, but a bit different to this process, because finally the Hindustan communities also were kept behind comparing to Europeans, kept behind the European countries. In 1526, Islam leader Muslim Babur conquered the northern Hindustan, and then moved further and created Mughal Empire, Empire of Great Mughals. Mughals, they And actually, that's the question very complicated, but someone thinks yes, they were, someone thinks not, they were not. Babur, already as the creator of this Mughal dynasty, had some problems with the Hindustan opposition. I mean that in the early 16th century, Guru Nanak, or Master Nanak, established new religion in Hindustan. This religion was called Sikhism. Actually, the idea of this new religion, though very popular, was that God is universe, and all souls after the death disperse into this universe. So you see God every day around you. This idea was so popular, and that Sikhism began very strong opposition to the Mughal authorities. Even more, you see, from 1799 to 1849, Sikhs had their own empire in India, their own state. But let's return to Mughals. Having such opposition, the grandson of Babur, Akbar, decided to tolerate his religious policy to keep population peaceful. He created the Holy Faith religion. Holy Faith religion is the combination of the Muslim features and Hinduism features there. He was very tolerant towards anyone in religious sense. But his grandson, Aurangzeb, in contrast, was very fanatic Muslim, very radical. He began a series of repressions against other religious confessions, against Buddhism, against Hinduism, and so on. The only good faith, only good religion for him was Islam only. And this, his not very good politics, became the factors of the internal collapse of the state, internal destabilization. There was revolts and disobediences and so on. And having such a good moment in the history of India, English colonizers, English joint stock company East India Company, began its penetration into the affairs, into the policy of India. Traders, administrators, diplomats, and so on, they moved into this continent, and finally they subordinated India to the interests of Great Britain. And finally, the last one, of course, Qin dynasty of China. Qin dynasty of China. That was the second foreign dynasty in history of China. What was the first foreign dynasty? Mongol dynasty. Remember? 13th to 14th centuries. Yuan. Yes? Yuan. This is the second foreign dynasty. You see the writing in English, and the pronunciation of this in Ukrainian is Qin or Qin. Don't confuse with Qin, because Qin is the real ancient dynasty in China, with the Qin Shi Huangdi as the emperor in the 3rd century before Common Era, and this is just Qin dynasty of Manchu nomads, Manchu pastoralists. Manchuria, this region at the north borders of China, conquered China and created its own dynasty there. And this dynasty lasted till the very end of the monarch state there. I mean, till 1912. Till 1912. They discriminated Chinese people, those Manchu people discriminated. They forced Chinese to have a special hairstyle called queue or nomadic queue. And since that day, Chinese people, they had such hairstyle. And of course, to have better positions in China of those days, you had to be Manchu from Manchuria. Ordinary people from China couldn't travel to Manchuria and couldn't get married with Manchu people. Couldn't get married because the laws prohibited this. In the last Tokugawa shogunate or shogunate in Japan, and the last one, that is very micro world, comparing to other worlds, with the samurais and shogun. Who is shogun in Japan? Shogun? Yeah, the chief, samurai chief, yes. Top leader, commander of samurais, shogun. Commander of samurais, the Japanese knights. In 1600, he established the new regime in Japan. Ieyasu Tokugawa, or Tokugawa Ieyasu, established new regime in Japan. And this period in Japan, all of this, from 1600 till the second half of 19th century, is characterized with the policy of self-isolationism, when being afraid of the Western decomposing influences of Europe, and especially Christianity, shogunate kept the policy of self-isolation. Shoguns in Japan in 17th century began to crack down on the Christians. They began to repress Christians, even killed Christians. They killed Christians. And this politics of self-isolationism actually was not very beneficial for Japan. Because of this policy, by the 19th century, Japan became an outdated state, backward state. So, you see, due to different factors, different features, events, Hindustan, Chinese civilization, Japan, Americas and Africa and so on, all of them were in disadvantageous positions if compared to European countries. It was a very perfect conditions for the development, conditions without any competition, for the development of the European colonial empires.